Thank you for this opportunity. I'm Anette Bringdahl-Hauge. I'm a PhD research fellow at the University of Oslo at the Department of Criminology and Sociology of Law. I would first of all like to thank the organizers for putting this conference and incredibly interesting program together. And I would in particular like to thank Shauna Carroll for your patience and feedback on the numerous inquiries. I'm sorry that I miss out on so many interesting presentations and discussions and encounters. I would have loved to be there with you. And I do hope that we do get the chance to meet later on. Now, the title of my paper reads Ordinary Men, Sexual War Violence and Perpetrator Constructions at the ICTY. And here I have modified the title somewhat, but the content is still the same. I'm going to talk about sexual or sexualized war violence and perpetrator constructions, perpetrator etiology constructions at the ICTY, which is the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, as you all know. And this paper forms part of a larger PhD research project on sexual war violence and perpetrator constructions. Now, before I go on, one of the first self-reflexive exercises of a study that seeks to increase our understanding of sexual war violence, its causes and context, and in particular a study that has a specific focus on perpetrators of this kind of violence, is for the researcher to recognize her own positionality. And for my part, I've never been at war. I've never lived under constant or recurring life-threatening conditions. I've never been part of a group that emphasized or encouraged violence, nor masculinity or sexuality in destructive ways. I'm female, I'm atheist, I have several years of education, I live in a relative, equality-based community, and I've led a safe life in terms of economic opportunities. And also, prior to my engagement in research, I have been involved in human rights work, and in particular minority women's human rights work, and also equality and anti-rape activism. So this is a very particular outset that forms sort of my take in this field. And there is a great distance from my positionality based on this particular combination of backgrounds to that of most individuals who become perpetrators of sexual violence in the context of war, in terms of gender, social, historical, educational, cultural, and or economic experiences, and also non-articulated cultural, structural, and situational dimensions or aspects. And in these distances, there is a danger of drawing simplistic conclusions, because that is what distance, whatever its forms, tends to do to our understanding of social phenomena. So the further away we are from the phenomena, the easier it becomes to make models or maps irrespective of or ignorant to important details and nuances. So if I do that, I hope that I'm questioned about it. Okay, so here's a little sneak peek of what I plan to do the next few minutes. I will go on with a very brief introduction to the perpetrator gap in research on sexual war violence, and then I will focus in on general perpetrator constructions, and I will end up with a categorization of available narratives about perpetrators of sexual war violence and their reasons for participating in this particular form of violence from a case study based on ICTY material. And I'll start off by claiming that the female victim orientation in this research field, important as it is for its many tremendous contributions, has also produced a research field where most theorization on sexual war violence and about perpetrators and etiology are based on assumptions derived from female victims' accounts. A consequence is that often the results of rape and sexual violence is taken to be the same as the motives. And moreover, the motives are not differentiated at different levels. Thus, the motives for superior leaders for supporting or even ordering sexual violence by troops are taken to be the same as the motives of individuals directly enforcing these tactics on the ground. Yet along these different levels of file and rank, motives may vary tremendously. So the known also the known potential benefits of an effective war strategy or the effective use of sexual violence as a weapon of war does not necessarily mean that sexual war violence is always commanded or asked for by superiors. So there are some assumptions here in the field that are not yet thoroughly explored. And I hold that when the experiences of individuals who directly commit sexual violence are excluded from studies of the phenomena, we fail to analyze issues that ultimately should be center stage as we develop preventive measures. So the dominating scholarly narrative about war criminals in general and perpetrators of atrocity crimes can be stripped down to that you're not so much who you are as where you are, with whom, and at what time in history. Admittedly, this is a very simplified account of a vast and nuanced scholarship, but the title of this paper draws on this dominating understanding of war criminals as ordinary men under extraordinary circumstances. And this framework or paradigm is above all credited to Hannah Arendt and her thesis on the banality of evil. This social constructivist orientation is also dominating in studies of sexual war violence. Although perpetrators are rarely at the focus of attention, this orientation, which I am also part of, comes along with an emphasis on the institutionalization and influence of militarized masculinity norms. And according to this framework, sexual violence then is committed by average Joes that are subjected to specific social and institutional pressures. And in this framework, there is little need to look at individual perpetrators because all the answers are in the social processes and structures surrounding him or her. Thus, this is a conceptualization of sexualized war violence that draws attention away from the individual perpetrators and inherent characteristics and refocuses on the social framework within which perpetrating individuals act. Now, when I still advocate a focus on individual perpetrators, I do so not because I believe in the reductionist idea of perpetrators as inherently bad or inherently mad. Rather, I do so because I think greater efforts at understanding perpetrators' perspectives and perceptions, their rationales or explanations can shed light both on context-specific and potentially non-transferable individual circumstances, and, importantly, the wider group processes, institutions, structures, and society that they live, thrive, and perpetrate within. And this, again, and the identification of potential transferable aspects or similarities across individual and conflict cases can help us gain a greater understanding of why sexual war violence is perpetrated and to a varying extent also perpetuated, and may ultimately form part of the basis upon which preventive efforts are developed. As much as I appreciate the ordinary man under extraordinary circumstances paradigm, it cannot by itself explain why so many, and perhaps most, soldiers actually refrain from participating in sexual violence, also in conflicts where such violence is widespread. So what is it that shifts the influence of social processes in one or the other direction among members of the same or similar armed groups? So in the next part, I will present findings from a study of relevant judgments and transcripts from court proceedings at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And the ICY offers verbatim accounts of court proceedings in transcripts published at its websites. And when direct access to established perpetrators are limited, these transcript pages offer an opportunity to sort of approach perpetrators indirectly. So I'll briefly go through some relevant numbers from the ICY. The ICY has convicted 30 individuals for sexual violence charges out of a total of 141 concluded proceedings. And 30 out of these final convictions relate to the direct participation of the convicted in the sexual violence charge or his immediate presence at the location of the sexual assault. And to date, 20 accused have submitted a guilty plea before the ISTY, out of which 12 guilty pleas have included confessions on sexual violence charges. And 5 out of these 12 guilty pleas are submitted by principal perpetrators of sexualized violence, out of which, again, 3, interestingly, were convicted for sexual violence directed against men. Now, of course, there are many limitations also to the transferability of findings from this material onto the wider universe of perpetrators out there. However, my purpose is not to offer any generalizable explanation or theory of sexualized war violence and its perpetrators. Rather, I want to start addressing the general research gap that exists with a specific focus on the extensive documentation provided by testimonies and statements of perpetrators, witnesses, victims, experts, judges, and counsels before the ISTY. Thus, I'll analyze how a particular court institution constructs particular perpetrators and their offenses related to a particular conflict through cases held before it. And I ask what kinds of stories or narratives are available in these particular settings. What I've done basically is to read the relevant parts of the transcripts of these cases and the judgments, and I've looked for stories that present reasons or etiological factors related to sexual war violence. The similarities between these completed cases before the STY that ended with convictions on sexual war violence charges, these similarities justify the construction of 5 typical narratives or explanations of perpetrators' participation. And I've labeled these categories or narratives: competition, conformity, opportunism, idealism, and survival. And of course, this categorization reflects my reading of the discursive practices that are relevant to the understanding of sexualized war violence in this material. Now, these idealized narratives that these labels, competition, conformity, opportunism, idealism, survival, refer to, should read as variants over the following sentences. Perpetrators of sexual war violence participate in sexual war violence in part due to idealism, say, or survival needs. And in the written paper, I've included examples of how these categorized narratives are identified in the transcripts. Here, I will simply briefly go through their meanings, starting with competition. Now, war is, at its core, a competition by violent means, by more or less well-defined in-groups and out-groups. Competition narratives refer to explanations that emphasize that sexual violence is used as a tool for competitive purposes. And typically, these narratives involve soldiers who seem to rape or sexually assault victims to demonstrate an extreme form of virility and or violent and ethnicized masculinity, either vis-a-vis peers or vis-a-vis the victim and the victim's group. Kunarak is an example of a case that draws on this narrative. Witness 183, which is a Bosnian Muslim woman, recounts before the court the multiple perpetrator rape that she was subjected to, and her testimony suggests that the rape was constructed as a means through which her perpetrators competed to demonstrate their respective manhood and to demonstrate their common ethnic and masculine superiority over the ethnic group to which witness 183 belonged. And an apparent common denominator of many excessive acts of violence and conflict and war situations is that it is committed by groups, and that group violence tends to be more extreme in form. Several multiple perpetrator rapes in the documentation from Bosnia illustrate how the rapes became more and more physically violent, that is, beyond the rape itself, the larger the number of perpetrators participating, which implies violent spiral, where the victim appears to be a tool upon which perpetrators compete to demonstrate an extreme form of violent masculinity vis-a-vis peers. And this requires a competitive environment. It requires dehumanization processes aimed at the victim and his or her group. And it also implies direct or implied peer pressure. Opportunism narratives emphasize how war provides an opportunity to rape or sexually assault that some take advantage of. either through their position or rank, through chaos, through minimal risk, or by encouraging environments, or all of the above. And in other scholarly literature on sexual war violence, these opportunity rapes are often called lust rapes. I also include sexual violence that is apparently committed as a way to ventilate and act out frustration in this category. Taking advantage of opportunity, either to satisfy desire or to act out frustration, does not necessarily suggest a pre-war inherent characteristic of the perpetrator. War, I suggest, can construct the ability and will to rape and to consider a situation as an opportunity for that purpose. It can also, through, for instance, widespread and institutionalized dehumanization, misogyny, heterosexism, or xenophobia, make it possible to see a girl or woman, man or boy, as a potential victim. And the case of Radic is one example of an opportunism narrative. Okay. Studies of war crime more generally, and social psychological experiments suggest that we should not underestimate human capability and willingness to act out of fear of not conforming to the standards, the actions and norms of the group to which one belongs or wish to belong to. Conformity narratives refers to perpetrators that underline how they did not dare to confront or behave differently than the group of which they were members. These narratives typically involve a more tacit form of peer pressure than that expressed in competition narratives earlier. And the perpetrators apparently were afraid to challenge group norms and behavior and acted despite moral inhibitions. Bralo drew on this narrative, and there's also an example in the Kunarak case. Several testimonies suggest that there is a powerful pressure upon soldiers and others who participate in armed forces to conform with practices and expectations of the group, even when these do not involve the morally right things to do. Idealism is intended to capture those narratives which appear to include those who have used sexual violence as a means to either reach political goals or to fulfill perceived duties as a good or perfect soldier, where orders and obedience come to play. Lonzo offers perhaps the clearest example of this narrative. Finally, perpetrators from all sides of the conflict claim to be acting out in orders, both in court proceedings and other reports. And some, however, also claim that if they did not act out on the orders, they themselves would be killed or targeted with violence. So survival narratives refer to perpetrators who feared or claimed to have feared for their lives unless they raped or sexually assaulted, and through that lived up to the demands or expectations of the group. Lonzo attempted this narrative, although unsuccessfully. So, these narratives are broad enough to capture all varieties of explanations that I could find in the ISTY court files, but still they're specified enough to make a sort of meaningful distinction between them. Importantly, the categories are not mutually exclusive. They overlap and are not by themselves sufficient explanations. They do not capture, say, everything there is to say or know about the perpetrators or the violence in question. Also, the empirical material that the narratives are based on only reflect a very limited part of the phenomenon that sexual war violence is, and only a selective group of perpetrators of its kind. Additionally, as reiterated by several chambers in judgments, the stress, trust, fear, and chaos induced by the war context is not a mitigating circumstance. Moreover, many individuals and soldiers lived under similar circumstances and pressures without resorting to the sort of violence that these convicted individuals did. More research efforts are needed to better understand why some opted for these forms of violence and others did not. But I hold that it is necessary to engage in research on the individual level to get the necessary level of detail and to point out specifically the contextual factors at play and that matters. The categorized narratives are intended to serve as analytical pegs according to which related variants of arguments on soldier perpetrators' participation in sexualized war violence are thematically clustered. and also as tools through which we can grasp the social processes and pressures at work. As an early step of an exploration of the research gap that still exists on perpetrators of sexual war violence, the categorized narratives provide a framework through which we can continue to approach and seek a better understanding of perpetrators. A central purpose of this paper is also to encourage and invite further analysis and thinking about perpetrators that goes beyond or behind sort of the overall paradigms. And it is in the combined contributions from a variety of disciplines and perspectives, and also in the nuances and complexities and even the contradictions that these produce, that sexual war violence is best understood. Okay, thank you for your attention. I hope that you do not hesitate to get in touch if you have comments and thoughts. Again, thank you.